at our tables we tell tales. That alongside the pen, paper, and dice play out in our minds in the theater that we all share, the theater of the mind. And there's entire systems dedicated to that kind of format, where it is the pen, paper, and the mind and the story you all share around the table, the narrative. But there's also the other part of that table, not just on the pen and pencil, but the physical, the material, the model, the mini. Hi, hello, and welcome to a discussion of miniatures and tabletop games, or tabletop RPGs specifically. Admitting my bias, just out the gate, over the past few years I've gotten into a lot more of like war games and skirmish games, but it's also bled over into miniatures for tabletop games, in general. And the role that those things can kind of take place within tabletop RPG, because yes, theater of the mind is a massive part of this system, and the narrative that carries over from session to session to session is a huge part of the experience. There is a little bit of magic and additional side of the hobbying that can come out with the miniatures themselves. So to begin, we're just going to be talking about the painting and making aspect of it itself right here, then we're going to go into a bit more narrow specifics with mob, monster, and character. But first, the hobbying side of it, the element that is just really bleeding over from the wargame side, of having references to the game, which is the wargame itself, or in this case, the tabletop RPG, and then the hobby, which is the collecting of minis, putting them together in the painting. It can also extend into other things, like other media, books, stories, and any other kind of artistic endeavor, but in general focusing on the minis and the painting side of it, which is the fact that it is an entire new avenue or another way you can build into your games. If you are a DM, yes, you are already handling a lot of different things, but if that is part of the aspect that you enjoy about the system and setting or whatever you're currently playing in, adding in the miniatures might not be a bad break from it. Not necessarily saying you need a break, but it can break up the monotony and be a slight release from just the notes, pressure, and story side of it. Again, not that it's a release, but it's another thing that you can delve into. Plenty of videos on building, kit bashing, painting models, and plenty of different lines and games that you can take from and proxy, especially since there's so many different settings that these tabletop RPG books can take place in. There's so many different models you could use, which also gets in the angle of just the using of models. As in, you don't really want to do that side of it. You don't want to put it together. You don't want to paint it. You just want it. A presence on the table, which in itself is part of the aspect of having these minis within these games. Because within a lot more of the tactical or wargamey-esque, as it's been called, tabletop systems, yeah, you need some kind of token or tracker, or at least something on a grid to identify who's where, and what's going on. And being able to have a specific miniature on the table to add a actual presence, because yes, there's a theater of the mind, but being able to have a consistent, immediate reminder as to a visual on the table of, oh, that's a massive boss demon right there. Sure, all the mob stuff is just basic tokens or even bottle caps, which I've actually used, but having that one big presence on the table itself, which doesn't just go to the one big one, but is quite nice. A center point to have an image and reference point that everyone else can see on the table. That this thing they're all imagining, they're actually seeing a reflection of it there. Their character in proximity to it. And in the case, I'm not saying it's a bad thing to not paint or build your own minis. If you are just 3D printing them or buying them off a shelf or buying them off eBay, that's entirely fine. This is more a discussion on just the impact and benefits of having them on the table in the first place, especially the latter half of this video. It's that way. Which, having covered briefly the painting assembling hobby, which if that is your thing or something to give a try, I highly recommend. I found I enjoyed it. There's then the present side of it, where it is just a physical thing on the table within a tactical board game, essentially, when you have a grid laid out. It's another thing to help, not necessarily keep attention, but another thing to have attention on. Even something to show off and invest, another thing to put into your games. Being able to actually place some kind of mutant abomination or monstrosity or evil dark knight when you're describing that in the game itself, when you usually just run tokens for general guards, that leaves an impact. That catches the player's attention. And if you're the one building and painting it ahead of time, adds into that idea that this is a specific character they're going to see. Which leads us on to the next topics. Down to the actual minis on the table, which we've divided into mob, monster, and character. Which, yes, there's others like terrain and such, which can also add to the experience itself, but specifically talking about minis, so the things with stat blocks. Starting off with mob, it's the general mass unit, the zombies, skeletons, goblins, gnolls, whatever you take. It is a big ask, not just to have that many models, but especially if you're going to be painting them, to paint them in the first place, have them ready, prepared, individualized. That is a big ask. To the point that it doesn't really matter. Might seem antithetical to a lot of what's just been discussed within this video itself on just like, oh yeah, models are cool, they add something to the game, and then saying right here it doesn't matter. I recommend tokens still, and maybe something to identify like what thing it is on the token, but I'm not saying to burn an entire bank account on buying hundreds of goblins, especially if you're a big horde user within your games. The way I kind of get around it is with later things, or having a larger set of tokens and maybe one mini on the table to represent that, or taking the place of one of them. Having a few goblins and a bunch of tokens that represent them, and then when they actually enter combat or it comes up that the stat block is needed, placing the mini on top of where that token was. Now that's a bit of shenaniganry and not really needed, and just a nice visual cue on seeing, oh, what's in combat, what's having an effect, what's doing something, which kind of leads into the third section of this, so we'll stop touching on that for a moment. But in short, you don't really need models for this, because they're not really going to have a long-lasting table presence to begin with in the first place outside of numbers and repetition. And when you're talking about some kind of price time investment, especially if you're doing the painting and assembling yourself, that's a big ask. But there is also something special to having maybe like 18 of these things within your repertoire, or within your cabinets, or on shelves somewhere. That you walk into a room or get trapped in a room where there's a necromancer and then there's 18 actual physical zombies on the table, that those massive bodies and tokens have a visual, physical presence on the table itself, vertical and meeting your character's head on. That, if used right, and used to accent other things, not just in mass hordes, but to show an identifiable threat that's around, the model itself can actually add. Not to mention a lot of horde units are actually probably the cheapest model-wise. Not always true, but usually lines up that way, because they're expected to be bought in bulk or a number. But in short, can add something, not necessarily worth it exactly, even in a video arguing for the use of minis and the priority of them within tabletop games. You could just use tokens. The monster, which gets into a bit more of leaning into what I'm talking about presence-wise. Because we've already briefly mentioned it with bosses or specific characters, or like a big dark knight, which, yeah, a massive evil paladin, something that's going to be a massive stat block or difficulty spike or a big boss fight or even just a mini boss of some kind or an important obstacle. There is a different feeling to placing a larger token in a fight with goblins and saying it's a dragon to there's tokens of goblins and then placing down an actual dragon mini. There is just some presentation to it and a feeling of, oh, that is the big important thing in the fight to pay attention to. Yes, there's goblins around. They are things moving around on the board that can be irritating. The dragon, though, that is something that demands your attention. And this applies to numbers of monsters, even sometimes mounts and vehicles, so things like cannons, like, oh, if that's actively being used in the fight and not just dress setting, though it could do dress setting, it's like, that's something to pay attention to. That cannon crew, you need to be looking at. The Minotaur, yes, that's a really big threat in this maze. The Ogre, the Troll, anything that's going to be a larger monstrosity, Chimera, Griffin, etc. The thing that you set down on the table and is going to not just be the center of the map geographically, which, I mean, depending on boss fights might be, but will just be the center of the map and the combat because it is the thing holding it together. It is the center of that encounter, which placing down an actual mini does. It has you focus on it. Yes, there's tokens everywhere else, especially if you go the tokens route, but even if you do have minis for zombies, bandits, cultists, whatever, that's the chaff. There's a lot of them. There's replications. But there's only one of that thing. And not to add, just if you've worked on this ahead of time, or not necessarily hit it, but just finally placing that big piece on the table, the mini and model itself announces the presence of the boss. Almost like the entrance of a big wrestling match. Like you might be describing the boss's lair, the scenario, some of the noise, it's the telltale signs of this kind of creature, and then without even announcing that it arrives, you grab it and place it on the table. It is part of the presentation, it is part of running it, it is the moment. There's something to the presence of a larger force and monster, especially because you're also not going to be having them in mass, so having just a single or a handful of those models isn't necessarily such a big investment or dip. But you have the benefit of when it's the center of the encounter, or the big focus of the encounter, to also opening the encounter. It is an opening and closer, visually on the table. Oh, this big threat has now entered the fight, and this big threat has left the fight when it's taken off, and is a visual representation on the board, not just an acknowledgement. And when it gets into more specific things, especially leaning towards bosses, but also characters. So the character section covers a number of things. Yes, NPCs, but players. Which has a bit of an upside and downside. Starting on the NPC side of it, yes, this has been broken down into another two sections. You have your NPCs, osses, allies, bosses. I think I said bosses twice. Which, unless they're involved in a counter, don't really need a mini. But when they do get involved within a fight, it's, oh shoot, there's blank character, and we have a visual representation of them on the board. They're actively involved in this fight. They have a presence on the table. It's almost as if they're actually here. Not really, I know, but it's an additional piece on top of the theater of the mind. Especially if the players have their own minis as well. To then have an NPC allied mini placed on the table is a huge thing. They're not just here in spirit, and they're not just here to like hand wave or add a stat boost, they're actually here on the table almost with us, the party themselves. And then when it heads to the boss side of it, it's similar to the monster angle where, oh, it's the opening and closer to a fight, the center of the encounter, but this idea of having heard of, described, talked to, fought against the efforts of a boss, villain, NPC of some kind, and then, oh, things are getting serious. We're not just in the theater of the mind hand-waving them away with a few different attacks, it's they're on the table. There's been enough effort and time that DM has put in to make or get a mini for this character. Oh no. That is something big. To again, that Dark Knight or Evil Paladin or the big villain of the game or just an arc. Because unlike the Monster Mini, which you would likely reuse a bunch of times, I mean, you can still reuse these, but it's usually the idea these are presented just for this fight. They'll probably be reused after for different minis, assets, and NPCs, but being able to have this made and placed down for this fight in particular, for this encounter in particular, that this campaign and sessions have led up to, there's a feeling to that being placed on the table. Because in a thing like a wargame or a skirmish game, even if you do have like a named or specific character that you customized or made or are running a named one from an established setting, it's expected that, oh yeah, win or lose this match, whether narratively it dies or not, I can replay this model in a later game. When it comes to a campaign and tabletop RPG, that is leading up to that specific moment and their specific death. That mini has been made and presented for this fight. To take your attention visually and place it within the center of the encounter, but to have an entire mini presented just for this one fight adds an air of just mystique to it. Yes, a boss fight early leading up to that moment, but it's not just, oh, tokens again on a map. It's maybe there's a special map, mechanics, rules, layer actions which come with the tin and are usually in the theater of the mind, but just adding in this one particular mini. Not just any dragon, this one specific ancient dragon. They've added horns to it, they've added this strange magic item to it, this evil wizard, this lich that we described having 3 different skulls, actually has 3 different skulls. That preparation mystique to actually defeating not just any general miniature taking its place, but that specific boss. Congrats, you've been placed on the table after being built up in this campaign, and the party is going to take you off of it. This isn't to say you like throw away or trash it, you can use it for later, but to have it made and presented in that big occasion, that is a special moment. Speaking of being placed on the table and running through multiple sessions, and really hurting if it goes off, the player miniatures. So most of this time we've been talking, it's been expected or generally seen as from the DM's perspective. As in, they're the one doing the prep on the campaign, the table, the aspects of where the game is being held, so likely they're also doing the miniatures. Because they know what NPCs are coming up, they know what monster blocks are to be prepared for, so of course, they've got the minis. This isn't to say at all that players can't be involved with the general process of making miniatures, especially if they're in the hobby side of it. Having a grouped set of miniatures that you can use for your games, that's a blast. But in short, it's expected the DM, GM, storyteller is handling most of the miniatures. The acquisition, preparation, whatever it is. The exception comes in with the players. Not saying that the DM can't have standby and proxies or even making the characters for them, but usually when a player character wants a mini of their character, it's usually from their angle that they're making, preparing, and putting a lot of effort into it. Because this isn't just a general monster model, and this isn't just a boss that's going to be used for one session. This is a miniature of the character you're playing and going to be doing for however long this campaign is, which can be a really long time. Which can be a really nice way and excuse for the players to get into that side of the hobby. Making the miniature, finding it, building the parts, or painting it. But the danger is, as the DM, you kind of have the wargame fallacy of it, is with most of your models and miniatures, yeah, when they die, they might come back in another encounter. Later on in the campaign, maybe in the next one, or just the next room. You can just place it down again. It's a Minotaur. It's the wargame mentality of win or lose. When it comes to the players, however, if that character dies, especially depending on the kind of system you're running, that might be it. That model might not be used, which adds a bit of back and forth and investment on the player's part, because it adds this tension of, you're not actually going to kill this character, right? I'm not going to lose this character, right? I spent $60 on this custom miniature. I paid someone else even more to paint this for me. Or I put my heart and soul into painting this and preparing this and customizing it with my own hours and labor. Like, that that adds some hesitation to killing off that character. Which, yes, isn't a target initially itself, but if you run a lethal game, that's an issue, and might honestly have players step away from ever having a custom miniature, which can be a sad thing, because a lot of the thing about table presence attention adds to having, oh, this is my specific half-elf warlock, or whatever it is. This is this named character. This is the character we've been talking about for hours, weeks, months, whatever it is, actually physically on the table. When they go down, and their mini is placed on the side when they go unconscious, or whatever it is, or disabled, or crippled, that is terrifying, of like, oh no, that character is vulnerable. Or whatever the number of tokens are on it, having that physical representation and attachment. Emotionally, it adds higher stakes and ties to the character within the encounters, which is a good and a bad thing. One, they're more invested in what's going on. Two, if that investment doesn't pay through, oh no. Just something to be wary of, but things over lethality of the game should be handled within a session 0. And just talked about overall. Because if everyone's on the same table on what's going on, which, I mean, they're at the same table, they should be. In short, if everyone knows what's going on, and is in on what's going on, and the lethality and agreement of what's going to happen, that should be expected, and that really should lift off the worry of if a character goes down. But investment, almost a gamble. To try and see him through to the end. And all those benefits of presence on the table, but for the party themselves, for the player themselves, that character. It helps to bring into the encounter and differentiate it from just tokens on a board, or the theater of the mind. And a reminder, this isn't to say theater of the mind is bad. I've run systems entirely in theater of the mind, but it's just saying that minis do actually add something to the table instead of just a nice looking thing. It adds something mentally to when it's placed in an encounter. When it's placed on that table, when it's painted, when it's made, when it is a specific character. Those are minis and tabletop RPGs. The tables and tales we tell. I think that might be the title. Thanks for watching, thank you to my patrons, and have a nice day.